The telegram arrived at the War Office on the 4th of June 1940, and it carried the kind of news that makes generals lose sleep. Operation Dynamo had just concluded. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers had been plucked from the beaches of Dunkirk, ferried home across the Channel by destroyers, fishing boats, and civilian yachts. It was a miracle of improvisation. It was also a catastrophe of logistics, because those exhausted men had left behind virtually everything that made an army function: artillery pieces, transport vehicles, ammunition stockpiles, and approximately 90,000 rifles. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped with their lives. They had not escaped with their weapons. Winston Churchill, barely a month into his premiership, understood immediately what this meant. Hitler's forces now controlled the entire western coastline of continental Europe, from Norway to the Spanish border. An invasion of Britain was not merely possible, but expected before autumn. And the army tasked with defending the homeland had more men than it had firearms to put in their hands. Some units were drilling with broomsticks. Home Guard volunteers were issued shotguns, borrowed from local farmers. The situation bordered on the absurd, except nobody was laughing. What Churchill needed was a weapon that could be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and in enormous quantities. Precision engineering was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. The traditional approach to armaments, carefully machined components, skilled craftsmen, lengthy testing protocols, would take 18 months to scale up. Britain might not have 18 weeks. The Prime Minister made his requirements brutally clear to the Ministry of Supply. Find a solution or face the consequences of having none. The submachine gun represented the obvious answer. Unlike bolt-action rifles, which required extensive training and produced slow rates of fire, a submachine gun could transform a factory worker with 2 weeks of instruction into a soldier capable of laying down devastating close-range firepower. The concept had proven itself in the trenches of the Great War, and Thompson submachine guns had demonstrated their effectiveness in American gangland warfare throughout the 1930s, but therein lay the problem. The Thompson was an American design, and Americans charged £40 per unit, an astronomical sum when multiplied across an army's worth of requirements. Worse still, American production capacity was already stretched thin, and shipping lanes across the Atlantic were infested with German U-boats. Britain would have to build its own. The task fell to the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock, a sprawling complex in North London that had been producing military firearms since 1816. Enfield's engineers had a reputation for meticulous craftsmanship. The Lee Enfield rifle, their signature creation, was considered among the finest bolt-action weapons ever manufactured. But meticulous craftsmanship was precisely what the current crisis did not permit. The men at Enfield were about to learn an entirely different philosophy of weapons design, one that valued speed over elegance and function over beauty. Two names would become inseparable from what followed: Major Reginald Shepherd, an expert in weapons inspection with an eye for unconventional solutions, and Harold Turpin, a draftsman whose practical ingenuity would prove more valuable than any engineering degree. Neither man had designed a firearm from scratch before. Neither man had time to worry about that fact. By the middle of June 1940, they had their orders. Britain needed a submachine gun that could be produced by the 1,000, distributed by the 100,000, and understood by any soldier who could point and pull a trigger. The weapon that emerged from their collaboration would become one of the most influential firearms in modern history, though in those desperate early days, influence was the last thing on anyone's mind. Survival came first. Everything else was theoretical. Shepherd and Turpin began work in a small drawing office at Enfield Lock during the third week of June 1940. They had no luxury of time for protracted design committees or elaborate testing regimens. What they had was a single guiding principle: simplicity above all else. Every curve that could be straightened would be straightened. Every machined component that could be stamped from sheet metal would be stamped. Every screw that served no essential purpose would be eliminated entirely. The weapon they envisioned would not win beauty contests. It would win a war. The name itself told the story. STEN combined the initials of the two designers, Shepard and Turpin, with the first two letters of Enfield. It was a functional designation for a functional object, devoid of romanticism or martial grandeur. By January 1941, the first working prototype had been completed. The entire development process had taken approximately 6 months, an almost unthinkable timeline for military ordnance. The Lee Enfield rifle, by comparison, had required nearly a decade of refinement before reaching frontline service. What emerged from Enfield's workshops looked less like a weapon and more like something assembled in a garden shed. The main body consisted of a simple steel tube, not unlike the tubing used in bicycle frames. The barrel was pressed and welded rather than precision bored. The stock on early models was little more than a skeletal metal frame that folded against the receiver. There was no wooden furniture, no elegant scrollwork, nothing that suggested the centuries-old tradition of British gunsmithing. Soldiers who first handled the Sten often remarked that it resembled plumbing equipment more than military hardware. They were not entirely wrong, but beneath that crude exterior lay genuine mechanical cleverness. Turpin had studied the German MP-18 and MP-28 submachine guns captured during the Battle of France, learning what worked and what could be discarded. The Sten operated on a simple blowback principle. When a round fired, the expanding gases pushed the bolt rearward against a spring, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round from the magazine. No complex locking mechanisms were required, no gas pistons or rotating bolts complicated the action. A soldier could disassemble the entire weapon into its component parts within seconds, using no tools whatsoever. The magazine presented particular challenges. Turpin initially designed a vertical box magazine holding 32 rounds of 9mm parabellum ammunition, the same cartridge used by German submachine guns, a deliberate choice that allowed British soldiers to scavenge enemy supplies if necessary. The magazine housing fed from the left side of the weapon, a configuration that kept the overall profile low when firing from prone positions. This horizontal feed would later cause feeding problems, but in the urgency of 1941, such concerns remained secondary. By February, the Mark I Sten had entered limited production. The early variants still incorporated some machined components, a wooden foregrip, a cone-shaped flash hider, and a more robust barrel shroud. These refinements added cost and manufacturing time, which rather defeated the purpose. Shepard and Turpin returned to their drawing boards, stripping away everything non-essential. The Mark II, approved for production in the spring of 1942, represented the ultimate expression of their philosophy. It could be manufactured using approximately 47 individual parts. It weighed just over 3 kilograms unloaded. Most importantly, it could be produced by workers with minimal training using machinery that had nothing to do with traditional arms manufacturing. The Sten was ready for mass production on a scale that Britain had never previously attempted. The factories were waiting. The genius of the Sten lay not in what happened at Enfield, but in what happened everywhere else. Traditional firearms production required specialized machine tools, precision gauges, and workers who had spent years mastering their craft. Britain possessed such facilities, but nowhere near enough of them to meet wartime demand. The Sten changed the equation entirely. Its components were so simple, its tolerances so forgiving, that virtually any factory with basic metalworking equipment could contribute to the effort. And contribute they did. By the summer of 1942, Sten production had spread across the industrial landscape like wildfire. The Birmingham Small Arms Company handled major contracts, naturally, but they were joined by manufacturers whose peacetime products bore no resemblance to weaponry. Lines Limited, a toy company, retooled its presses to stamp out receiver tubes. Furniture workshops abandoned chairs and tables in favour of trigger assemblies. Even His Majesty's prisons contributed, with inmates at several facilities manufacturing Sten components as part of war work programmes. The weapon that had begun life in a cramped Enfield drawing office was now being born in hundreds of locations simultaneously. The numbers tell the story most eloquently. During 1942 alone, British factories produced approximately 350,000 Sten guns. The following year, output exceeded 500,000. By the war's end, total production had reached nearly 4 million units, a staggering figure that dwarfed the manufacturing capacity of any comparable program. The Thompson submachine gun, America's equivalent, managed approximately 1.5 million units across the entire conflict. The Sten had beaten it by a factor of more than 2 to 1. Cost reduction accompanied this production miracle. The Mark I Sten had entered service at a unit price of approximately £5 and 5 shillings. Refinements to the Mark II pushed that figure lower still, eventually settling around £2 and 10 shillings for basic models. When factoring in wartime inflation and currency fluctuations, the commonly cited figure of £8 represents a reasonable average across variants and production runs. Compare this to the Thompson's £40 price tag, or the approximately £25 required to manufacture a Lee Enfield rifle, and the Sten's economic advantage becomes overwhelming. Britain could arm 5 soldiers with Stens for the cost of a single Thompson. The manufacturing process itself bordered on the agricultural. Receiver tubes were cut from standard mild steel stock using equipment found in any plumbing shop. The barrel, perhaps the most critical component in traditional firearms, was produced through a simplified cold pressing process rather than the laborious boring and rifling that precision weapons demanded. Spot welding replaced screws wherever possible. The wooden components that graced early models vanished entirely, replaced by simple wire frames that soldiers could bend back into shape if damaged. One apocryphal story, repeated in multiple memoirs, describes a Sten being assembled using parts fabricated in a bicycle repair shop during a single afternoon. Quality control suffered accordingly, and soldiers would soon discover the consequences. But in 1942, quality control was a secondary concern. The primary objective remained getting weapons into hands that currently held nothing. Every week that production accelerated was a week that the Home Guard gained capability, that commandos received equipment for raids, that the army building in Britain for eventual operations in Europe grew stronger. The Sten was never intended to be a perfect weapon. It was intended to be a weapon that existed in sufficient quantities to matter. By that measure, it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The plumber's nightmare had become the quartermaster's dream. Soldiers have always complained about their equipment. It is a tradition as old as warfare itself. But the complaints directed at the Sten gun carried a particular intensity, born from the uncomfortable reality that the weapon sometimes tried to kill its user. The litany of grievances became legendary within the British armed forces, passed down through barracks gossip and reinforced by bitter first-hand experience. The Sten was cheap, the soldiers agreed. It was also temperamental, unreliable, and occasionally murderous. The most infamous problem involved accidental discharges. The Sten's simple blowback mechanism relied on a heavy bolt held rearward by a spring-loaded cocking handle. When the trigger was pulled, the bolt flew forward, stripped a round from the magazine, and fired it upon chambering. This open bolt design offered advantages for cooling during sustained fire, but it created a dangerous vulnerability. If a soldier dropped the weapon, or knocked it sharply against a wall, or simply jarred it during movement, the bolt could slip forward without any trigger input whatsoever. The gun would fire on its own. Reports of such incidents accumulated throughout the war. Soldiers were wounded in transport trucks when Stens discharged after hitting potholes. Men died in training exercises when dropped weapons sprayed rounds across assembly areas. One particularly grim account from the Italian campaign describes a corporal killed by his own Sten after stumbling during a night patrol. The weapon had no manual safety worthy of the name, merely a notch in the cocking handle slot that theoretically locked the bolt in place. Soldiers learned quickly that this notch could not be trusted. The magazine caused equally persistent frustrations. Its 32-round capacity looked impressive on paper, but the feeding mechanism proved chronically unreliable. The double-column, single-feed design forced rounds to narrow through a constriction point before entering the chamber, and any dirt, dust, or slight deformation of the magazine lips could cause catastrophic jams. Soldiers in North Africa, where sand infiltrated everything, cursed the Sten with particular venom. Standard practice involved loading only 28 or even 25 rounds to reduce spring tension and improve reliability. The theoretical capacity became a cruel joke. Field modifications proliferated accordingly. Soldiers wrapped cloth around magazines to keep out debris. They filed down feed lips that had become bent. They scavenged parts from disabled weapons to replace worn components in functioning ones. Armourers developed informal tricks for improving reliability, specific ways of loading magazines, particular cleaning routines, modifications to the bolt that reduced jamming. None of these fixes appeared in official manuals. They spread through the oral tradition of men who had learned, the hard way, what worked and what did not. Yet for all its flaws, the Sten possessed one redeeming virtue that outweighed the complaints. It functioned when it mattered most. The same soldiers who cursed the weapon in training often praised it in combat. Its simplicity meant that field repairs were possible under conditions that would render more sophisticated weapons permanently disabled. A bent component could be hammered straight. A broken spring could be improvised from available materials. Mud that would have destroyed a precision instrument could be cleared from a Sten with a quick disassembly and wipe down. The weapon was crude, but crude meant repairable. The love-hate relationship endured throughout the war. Soldiers nicknamed it the Woolworth gun, the plumber's nightmare, and considerably less printable alternatives. They also carried it into battle across every theatre where British forces fought. The Sten was not the weapon anyone wanted. It was the weapon everyone had. That distinction made all the difference. The aircraft flew low over occupied France. Engines throttled back to reduce noise. Navigation lights extinguished against the darkness. Somewhere below, a reception committee of Maquis fighters waited in a forest clearing, torches ready to mark the drop zone. The cargo containers tumbling from the bomber's belly that night in 1943 contained ammunition, explosives, wireless sets, and dozens of Sten guns wrapped in oiled cloth. Within hours, those weapons would vanish into the countryside, distributed among resistance cells that Nazi occupation forces would spend months failing to locate. The Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army of saboteurs and guerrilla coordinators, recognized the Sten's potential almost immediately after its introduction. Here was a weapon perfectly suited to clandestine warfare. It was compact enough to hide beneath a coat or bury in a shallow cache. It was simple enough that untrained civilians could learn to operate it within an afternoon. It fired the same 9mm ammunition that German occupiers carried, allowing partisans to resupply themselves from enemy casualties. And it was cheap enough that losing one to a failed operation or a compromised safe house represented an acceptable cost rather than a strategic setback. SOE began systematic Sten drops in earnest during 1942, coordinating with resistance movements across occupied Europe. France received the largest share, with an estimated 100,000 weapons delivered to various Maquis networks by the war's end. But the Sten's reach extended far beyond French borders. Danish resistance fighters used them to assassinate collaborators and sabotage industrial facilities. Norwegian partisans carried them on raids against heavy water plants crucial to German atomic research. Polish Home Army soldiers stockpiled Stens throughout 1943 in preparation for the Warsaw Uprising that would erupt the following August. The weapon's disassembly characteristics proved particularly valuable for clandestine operations. A complete Sten could be broken down into components small enough to pass through routine checkpoints concealed in shopping bags, toolboxes, or hollowed-out loaves of bread. Resistance couriers transported barrel tubes disguised as bicycle parts, magazines hidden among legitimate metalwork, receiver assemblies wrapped in butcher paper. German security forces searching for weapons often looked past innocuous-seeming objects that could be reassembled into lethal firepower within minutes of reaching their destination. Underground workshops across occupied Europe began manufacturing their own Stens, using blueprints supplied by SOE or copied from captured examples. The weapon's simple construction made local production feasible in ways that would have been impossible with more sophisticated firearms. Polish resistance fighters in Warsaw produced an estimated 11,000 Sten copies in clandestine factories hidden in basements and backrooms. Danish workshops contributed several thousand more. These locally manufactured weapons varied in quality. Some were virtually indistinguishable from British originals, while others were dangerously crude. But they filled a desperate need for armament that airdrops alone could never satisfy. The psychological impact matched the material contribution. A resistance fighter carrying a Sten was no longer merely a civilian harboring forbidden thoughts. He had become a combatant, capable of engaging occupation forces on something approaching equal terms. The weapon represented tangible proof that Britain had not forgotten the conquered nations, that liberation remained a genuine possibility rather than a distant fantasy. Memoirs from French, Dutch, Belgian, and Norwegian resistance veterans consistently describe the arrival of the first Sten shipments as transformational moments, the point at which symbolic defiance became practical resistance. The plumber's nightmare had found its true calling in the shadows of occupied Europe. German infantry marching into Poland in September 1939 carried what many experts considered the finest submachine gun yet devised. The Maschinenpistole 40, the MP40, was a masterpiece of thoughtful engineering, incorporating lessons learned from 2 decades of submachine gun development. Its folding metal stock allowed compact transport. Its controlled rate of fire improved accuracy during automatic shooting. Its reliability under adverse conditions had been proven across multiple campaigns. The MP40 looked like a weapon designed by engineers who cared about craftsmanship. The Sten looked like something assembled during a plumbing emergency. Yet by 1945, the Sten had outproduced, outdeployed, and ultimately outlasted its German rival. The comparison illuminates a fundamental difference in military philosophy. German weapons development throughout the war emphasized technical excellence, often at the expense of manufacturing efficiency. The MP40 required extensive machining operations, precision tolerances, and quality materials. Each unit demanded approximately 14 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly equivalent to the Sten's cost, but requiring significantly more skilled labor and specialized equipment. When German factories came under Allied bombing campaigns, this complexity became a critical vulnerability. Damaged machine tools could not easily be replaced. Skilled workers, killed in air raids, left gaps that apprentices could not fill. Production bottlenecks multiplied as the war progressed. The STG-44 represented an even more ambitious German project and an even more instructive failure. Entering service in 1944, this revolutionary assault rifle combined the range of a traditional infantry rifle with the automatic firepower of a submachine gun. Military historians generally credit it as the first true assault rifle, the conceptual ancestor of the AK-47 and every similar weapon that followed. Its influence on post-war firearms development was profound and lasting. Its influence on the war itself was negligible because Germany never managed to produce enough of them. Approximately 425,000 STG-44 rifles reached German forces before the war's end. An impressive number by peacetime standards, woefully inadequate for a military fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who manufactured weapons by the million. Each STG-44 required specialized machinery to produce its stamped steel receiver, precision equipment to rifle its barrel, and trained workers to assemble its relatively complex mechanism. The weapon was technically superior to virtually everything the Allies fielded. Technical superiority proved irrelevant when soldiers lacked ammunition, spare parts, and replacements for units lost in combat. British planners had grasped this fundamental truth from the beginning. Wars of attrition favoured the side that could replace losses fastest, not the side that lost the least. A Sten destroyed in combat could be replaced within days from stockpiles that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A damaged MP40 or lost STG-44 represented a far more significant gap in German capabilities, one that increasingly overstretched factories struggled to fill. The mathematics of industrial warfare favoured simplicity over sophistication. German engineers recognized the problem too late. Desperate attempts to simplify production during 1944 and 45 yielded weapons like the Volkssturmgewehr, the People's Assault Rifle, a crude last-ditch design intended for distribution to civilian militias. The Volkssturmgewehr was Germany's belated attempt to replicate the Sten philosophy. Minimum materials, minimum machining, maximum output. But by then, Allied forces had already crossed the Rhine. The factories that might have produced millions of simplified weapons were being captured or destroyed. Germany's engineering excellence had won countless tactical engagements. Britain's pragmatic austerity had contributed to winning the war. The surrender documents signed in May 1945 should have marked the Sten's retirement. It was a weapon born from desperation, designed for a crisis that had now passed. Surely modern armies would replace it with something better, something more refined, something that did not accidentally discharge when dropped on hard surfaces. Instead, the Sten embarked on a second career that would prove even longer and more varied than its wartime service. British forces carried Stens into the jungles of Malaya during the 12-year emergency that began in 1948. Communist insurgents hiding in dense vegetation presented exactly the kind of close-quarters threat that submachine guns handled effectively, and the military possessed warehouses full of Stens left over from the war. Why manufacture new weapons when perfectly functional ones already existed? The same logic applied in Kenya, where British soldiers fought Mau Mau rebels throughout the 1950s, and in Cyprus, where Eoka militants waged their campaign for union with Greece. The Sten remained standard issue for British forces well into the 1960s, nearly a quarter century after its rushed wartime introduction. Korea provided the Sten's largest post-war deployment. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, Commonwealth nations rushed troops to support the United Nations response. British, Australian, and Canadian soldiers arrived carrying equipment that would have been familiar to their fathers who fought in Normandy, including substantial numbers of Sten guns. The weapon performed adequately in Korean conditions, though its limitations became increasingly apparent when compared to newer American designs. Still, it shot, it killed, and it was available. Those qualities trumped theoretical improvements that existed only on drawing boards. Beyond official military channels, the Sten proliferated through less formal means. Its simplicity made it ideal for clandestine reproduction, a characteristic that various groups exploited throughout the post-war decades. Jewish paramilitary organizations in Palestine manufactured copies during the 1940s, arming fighters who would eventually form the core of the Israel Defense Forces. Workshops in India and Pakistan produced unauthorized versions that circulated through regional conflicts for generations. Anywhere that basic metalworking tools existed, the Sten could theoretically be reproduced. This underground longevity proved remarkably persistent. Police raids in Northern Ireland during the Troubles regularly uncovered Sten guns, some original wartime production, others locally manufactured copies, hidden in arms caches alongside more modern weapons. Criminal organizations in various countries favored the Sten precisely because it could be produced without traceable supply chains. As recently as 2019, Brazilian authorities seized improvised submachine guns clearly based on Sten designs, manufactured in illegal workshops for distribution to drug trafficking gangs. The original engineering drawings that Shepard and Turpin created have long since entered the public domain, reprinted in countless books and distributed across the internet. Anyone with access to basic machining equipment can theoretically produce a functional Sten receiver. This accessibility represents both the weapon's greatest legacy and its most troubling consequence. The same characteristics that allowed wartime Britain to arm itself against invasion now allow non-state actors to arm themselves against legitimate authorities. Military historians sometimes describe the Sten as the first truly democratic firearm, a weapon that could be produced and maintained by ordinary people rather than specialized institutions. Whether this democratization represents progress or peril depends largely on who holds the weapon in question. What remains undeniable is the Sten's extraordinary persistence. 70 years after the war that created it ended, the plumber's nightmare continues to surface in conflict zones, criminal enterprises, and police evidence lockers around the world. Few weapons designed by committees of experts can claim equivalent longevity. The last German weapon factory fell silent in 1945. The precision machinery that had produced MP40s and STG-44s was dismantled, shipped east as Soviet war reparations, or simply left to rust in bombed-out buildings. The engineering drawings were captured, studied, and filed away in Allied archives. Within a decade, the weapons themselves had largely vanished from active service, replaced by newer designs that incorporated wartime lessons but owed nothing to German manufacturing capacity. The Third Reich's armory, for all its technical brilliance, died with the regime that created it. The Sten, by contrast, refused to disappear. Its continued presence in conflicts across 7 decades represents something more significant than mere mechanical durability. It represents the triumph of a philosophy, the recognition that in industrial warfare, quantity possesses a quality all its own. German engineers had asked how to build the best possible weapon. British engineers, faced with annihilation, had asked a different question. How do we build enough weapons to survive? The answer they provided reshaped military thinking for generations. Modern infantry weapons bear the Sten's conceptual fingerprints, even when they share none of its specific components. The stamped metal receivers that characterize assault rifles, from the AK-47 to the modern AR-15 platform, descend directly from the manufacturing principles that Shepard and Turpin pioneered. The emphasis on field-stripping simplicity, on reliability over precision, on designs that conscript factories can produce, all of these priorities trace their lineage to a desperate summer in 1940 when Britain needed weapons faster than traditional methods could provide. Military procurement officers today speak of design for manufacture as though it were a recent innovation. The Sten embodied that principle 80 years ago. They discuss total cost of ownership and logistics footprints in language that would have baffled 1940s planners, but the underlying calculations remain identical. A weapon that cannot be produced in sufficient quantities is worthless regardless of its performance specifications. A weapon that cannot be maintained by ordinary soldiers under field conditions will fail when needed most. A weapon that consumes resources disproportionate to its tactical value weakens the force that carries it. The 8-pound Sten taught these lessons through brutal practical demonstration. It armed the soldiers who stormed Normandy beaches on the 6th of June 1944. It equipped the paratroopers who dropped into Arnhem that September. It rode in the packs of commandos who raided German installations from Norway to the Mediterranean. It reached resistance fighters who had nothing else with which to oppose occupation. It was never elegant. It was never beloved. It was there, in numbers sufficient to matter, at the moments when presence determined survival. Germany built weapons for the war it wanted to fight, short decisive campaigns, won through technological superiority and tactical brilliance. Britain built weapons for the war it actually faced, a prolonged industrial struggle where survival depended on outproducing enemies rather than out-engineering them. The Sten represented that philosophy reduced to 47 components and 3 kilograms of stamped steel. It worked often enough, it could be replaced immediately when it failed, and there were always more where the last one came from. History remembers the SDG-44 as a revolutionary design that transformed infantry warfare. History remembers the Sten as a crude stopgap that soldiers tolerated because nothing better was available. Yet 80 years later, one of these weapons still appears in conflict zones around the world, while the other exists only in museums and private collections. The plumber's nightmare outlived every gun Germany ever built. Sometimes, in warfare as in life, showing up is the victory that matters most.